Choose your interpretation channel. We're going to start now. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining. Eh, bueno, pues es un placer estar aquí. Mi nombre es Eugenia López Uribe, soy la directora de IPPF para las Américas y el Caribe y es un honor moderar este webinario con un tema que me apasiona. Quisiéramos conocer un poco más sobre ustedes, así que Lili nos va a mostrar una encuesta de Zoom para que por favor escojan cuál es la opción que mejor describe su rol. Vamos, por favor escojan cuál es la opción que describe mejor su rol. Ok. Em, ¿Cuántos votos llevamos hasta ahorita? Ok. Vemos por favor los resultados. Ah, muy interesante. Bueno, pues bienvenidos a este webinario. Vemos que tenemos una buena representación de todos los roles. Muchas gracias por conectarse. Mi compañera Sara va a poner los usuarios de Twitter en el chat para que si quieren distribuir información en redes sociales, por favor, usen nuestros tags. Em, Como saben, estamos organizando el webinario como el grupo de trabajo sobre sexualidad y matrimonios y uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas. Este es un grupo que ha iniciado a trabajar desde el 2016 con el objetivo de generar evidencia sobre el control de la sexualidad como una de las causas estructurales más importantes de los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles. Nos hemos dedicado a producir investigaciones, recursos, pero también a tener conversaciones que apoyen el abordaje desde un enfoque transformador de género, uno que promueva la autonomía, los derechos y las oportunidades de las adolescentes y jóvenes para que decidan casarse o tener hijos o no hacerlo con plena libertad, información y recursos que les permitan construir la vida que desean. En los últimos años nos hemos estado enfocando en el tema de las leyes, porque aunque nuestro movimiento ha empujado para que las tengamos, la evidencia no confirma que haya una relación directa causa-efecto entre la existencia de las leyes y la disminución del matrimonio infantil. Es más, sabemos que existe alguna evidencia de casos en los que esas leyes se han convertido en amenazas a los derechos de las niñas, de las jóvenes, de las adolescentes y sobre todo de las personas en mayor vulnerabilidad. Creemos que así como estamos invirtiendo recursos en evaluar los programas, también es importante generar evidencia sobre los efectos y los impactos de las leyes y políticas para asegurar que benefician a las adolescentes y garantizar sus derechos humanos. Y creemos, como Shireen Ebadi, la abogada y activista iraní, ha dicho, que las leyes son una herramienta para avanzar en la justicia, en los derechos humanos y en el Estado de Derecho, pero que esas leyes deben reflejar y promover las aspiraciones sociales de justicia e igualdad y deben representar los valores y principios de la sociedad para que puedan servir a alcanzar las aspiraciones colectivas de las personas a las que sirven. El día de hoy no vamos a revisar la evidencia. Nuestras compañeras de Girls Not Price acaban de tener un webinario en donde lo hicieron. Podemos ver en el chat donde consultar también ese webinario. Nuestro propósito el día de hoy es explorar qué sigue para nuestro movimiento una vez que ya hemos tenido estos hallazgos sobre la evidencia. El grupo de trabajo ha desarrollado un posicionamiento en donde hemos analizado el tema para ayudar a pensar cómo podemos diseñar leyes que trabajen mejor a favor de las adolescentes y las juventudes con ellas. necesitamos que ellas estén participando. Les invitamos a consultar nuestro posicionamiento. También en el chat vamos a poner el link. Y bueno, antes de iniciar con nuestro poderoso panel, quisiera mostrar un poquito de energía a la conversación. Entonces, les queremos pedir que por favor nos ayuden a crear una nube de palabras. Vamos a tener una nube de palabras en los 5 idiomas. Lili va a ponernos el Menti para que podamos desarrollarlo. Van a recibir una invitación del Mentímetro. Ah, y les pedimos que por favor escriban la primera palabra que les venga a la cabeza cuando piensan en las leyes y el matrimonio infantil, por favor. Vemos el mentímetro en la pantalla, por favor. Vamos a dar un par de minutitos más para que se acabe de formar. Ok, creo que ya hemos tenido, ya hemos recibido las respuestas. Creo que la nube es muy interesante. Las palabras que se han puesto al centro son abuso y pobreza. También hay algunos temas buenos que han salido, derechos humanos. Entonces creo que estamos todos y todas alineadas en que esta conversación es muy importante tenerla. Voy ahora a presentarles a nuestro panel. Estamos muy contentas con la representación que tenemos y les recordamos, muchas gracias por estarse presentando en el chat. También les pedimos que por favor usen el chat de preguntas y respuestas para poner sus preguntas. Las estaremos recolectando a lo largo de todo el webinario y serán respondidas al final. Les presento entonces, nuestras panelistas son Surbi Kumar, que participa desde la Youth Foundation, de YP Foundation de India, perdón, la traducción al español no me salió. Alfa Kimweri, que viene de Medea, África, en Tanzania. Sara Martínez, de Balance, México. Y Madhu Mehra, de Partners for Law in Development de India. Les pido por favor a las panelistas que cuando estén hablando pongan sus cámaras. Vamos a iniciar esta conversación con una pregunta en relación a su contexto y su experiencia para que por favor nos comparten qué es algo que funciona de las leyes sobre matrimonio infantil y algo que no funciona sobre las leyes de matrimonio infantil en su contexto. Empezamos con Surbi, por favor. You're muted, Surbi.
Surbi, you're on mute. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Hi. Can you hear me now? Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Eugenia, for the question. So in my experience of working with adolescent girls, young people, and different stakeholders at the grassroots level in India, we have seen that the journey from Sharda Act to the current law on child marriage, which is PCMA, has evolved the conversation around marriage as an institution and the need to have a legal safeguard around it. This law has actually also helped in bringing out the conversation on CEFMU at the center stage and has pushed the communities and families to understand and accept that the marriage below 18 years of age for girls and 21 for boys is illegal. In Indian context, everyone has an opinion on when, how, who, and why people should get married. And when it comes to people assigned female at birth and their sexuality, there is a lot of investment in those opinions. Therefore, another thing that got highlighted is the important role that the larger ecosystem plays around adolescents, whether it is parents, guardians, teachers, CSOs, or even state. PCMA has become an important tool to hold conversations with stakeholders across different levels of institutions. This law has actually also brought out the important conversation around adolescent agency, choice, and bodily autonomy. But are these nuanced enough that the diverse young people in India can negotiate decisions around marriage without the legal framework? Sadly, no, not yet. And that brings us to the dichotomy. The dichotomy here is that the implementation of the law is completely silent on adolescent agency, consent, and choice. It does not acknowledge and recognize the lived experiences of young people in India at all. It also lacks the will of various stakeholders to uphold the autonomy and choice of young people and adolescents. We find that rarely is the law used to uphold a young person's right to choose, but ready to dictate when, how, who, and why a person should get married. Over to you, Ahinya.
Thank you very much for this first question. Now I will give the floor to Alpha Kimari, who is joining from Africa. Please, Alpha, same question to you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I believe you are hearing me well. Regarding the question that you have asked, what doesn't work? Regarding the minimum age of marriage. In Tanzania, actually, our marriage law itself, it does allow the people below the age of 18 to get married. The marriage law of 1971 in section 13 and 17, it shows that girls can be married at the age of 15 when there's consent of parents or guardians. But also if the girl is pregnant and she is in the age of 14, she can get married under the approval of court of law. And then for the part of men, I mean male, the law shows that they can get married at the age of 16. So you can see even the law itself, even though it allows girls to be married below the age of 18, but also it is not gender equal. But also, even though the law shows girls the minimum age of marriage is 14, but also in Tanzania, girls are being married below the age of 14. So there you can see that even though the law is there, but the social cultural norms are the one that guide the issues of marriage. And this is due to sometimes poverty, because sometimes when a girl is getting pregnant, then the family is forcing her to get married because the family is actually seeing that first of all, the pregnant is inappropriate in our society, but also it's like a burden in a family, so she have to get married, and that And also, there are some other systems like the family forcing the girls in young age, like 13 and 12, to get married because they want to collect like cows as a symbol of wealth. But sometimes you can see they collect cows because the elder brothers want to get married. So at home there is no cows, so they have to force the young a young girl to get married so as the elder brothers can get the cows for them to be able to offer for the marriage. So as a result, uh, many girls are dropping out from school because they are being forced to get married. And the statistics in 2019 shows that almost 2% of the girls are being out of school because of this. And also in health um, statistics, it shows that the adolescent girls and young women are the one that leading the new HIV infection in Tanzania. But also the maternal death is high for adolescent girls and young women. So you can see that the law itself does not actually promote the rights of young girls. So turning to other question that what does it work is even though the law shows that girls can be married below the age of 18, but it has helped to bring the discussion on the minimum age of marriage in Tanzania. Also, the laws alignment, these laws that promote the well-being and rights of children. So the law itself, it tries to bring something that shows the discrepancy between the legal frameworks in Tanzania. But also it has brought the Ministry of Constitution and Legal Affairs to discuss on the minimum age of marriage. And currently in Tanzania, they are conducting a survey just to collect the opinions of citizens on the minimum age of marriage. So in terms of what works, it's that. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Alfa. Y ahora vamos de Tanzania a México. Le doy ahora la palabra a Sara Martínez de Balance para que por favor nos comparta qué ha funcionado y qué todavía no ha funcionado en las leyes y el matrimonio infantil. Sara, por favor.
Gracias, Eugenia. Buenos días a todos. En México hemos tenido 3 experimentos con la ley que nos han dado luz sobre cosas que funcionan y algunas otras que no, pero que sin duda nos han dejado muchas reflexiones. El primer experimento que tuvimos fue el alza de la edad mínima para contraer matrimonio a los 18 años en los códigos civiles. Esto ha probado ser pues poco útil porque no aborda las uniones informales ni tradicionales que se hacen fuera de la ley, ¿no? Ese sería el primer experimento. El segundo, y que surge a raíz como de los problemas que nos da el primero, es que en las leyes existían figuras llamadas excepciones, las cuales permitían que personas menores de 18 y mayores de 14 accedieran al matrimonio en casos graves y justificados a través de la orden de un juez y con consentimiento de los padres, ¿no? Y nuestro más reciente experimento fue la creación del tipo penal de cohabitación forzada, la cual es bastante nueva y está intencionada para abordar los vacíos que dejaron las leyes previas y enfocarse particularmente en las poblaciones donde son más comunes los matrimonios y uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas. Esta última busca castigar con cárcel a quien presione, coaccione, arregle, o sea, parte de una unión informal que se asemeje a un matrimonio con cárcel, ¿no? Y plantea penas que son mayores para quienes se adscriben como personas indígenas. Esto nos ha dado luz sobre cosas que funcionan, ¿no? En este lado de la moneda hemos visto que a raíz de estos experimentos hay más visibilización sobre el tema de los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas en nuestro país. Hemos visto que el gobierno ha reconocido que este es un fenómeno que sucede en México y en los diferentes contextos mexicanos, no únicamente en comunidades indígenas, sino en muchos de los contextos cotidianos que vemos en México y que es un fenómeno que debe abordarse, ¿no? A raíz de esto, el gobierno ha creado algunos programas que les permiten a quienes están en estos matrimonios o uniones continuar con sus estudios y acceder a algunos de los otros derechos que son garantizados a través de la figura del matrimonio. Esto nosotros lo vemos como un avance porque justamente tiene que ver con el acceso a derechos de las personas que están en este tipo de arreglos, ¿no? También vimos que la eliminación de las excepciones y en específico el debate que se vio en la Suprema Corte de Justicia basado en la aprobación, digamos, de la eliminación de estas reservas o de estas excepciones, fue un debate elevado, fue un debate robusto, donde el consentimiento y la autonomía fueron centrales para la decisión que tomó la Suprema Corte, ¿no? La decisión que tomaron fue justamente aprobar la eliminación de estas despensas, puesto que no consideraban el consentimiento de las personas afectadas. Como decía, se basaba en el consentimiento de un juez y de los padres de las personas que estaban en esta situación de pedir el permiso, digamos, a esta autoridad judicial. Al no estar el consentimiento ahí de las adolescencias, pues se considera que es importante más bien poner el foco ahí y no dejar, digamos, a criterio de otras personas adultas el que decidiera, ¿no? Y además, en este debate se señaló la necesidad de garantizar los derechos de quienes están en los arreglos, independientemente de si están casados o no. Esto sin duda nos dio luz sobre el camino, como sobre a dónde podíamos irnos moviendo, ¿no? Pero no todo es perfecto, ¿no? Y también sabemos que hay cosas que no han funcionado. Primero me gustaría señalar que pues nos centramos en los matrimonios y no necesariamente en las uniones con el primer experimento. Y hoy tenemos más uniones informales pasando al margen de la ley, lo cual nos ha quitado la posibilidad de tener datos certeros sobre estas prácticas y también ha aislado a quienes están en ellos. Y la preocupación más grande que tenemos desde Balance ahora con la criminalización y la creación del tipo penal de cohabitación forzada tiene que ver con que esta no resuelve los problemas de raíz, sino que individualiza los problemas a través del castigo y elimina las posibles redes de apoyo a quienes estén en estas uniones o matrimonios, puesto que esas son las personas en quienes se centra, ¿no? La criminalización, en las personas que los rodean, que pueden estar influyendo en que exista o no un matrimonio y estigmatiza las decisiones de las adolescencias y afecta desproporcionadamente a comunidades indígenas con mayores penas. Em, en un país donde el acceso a la justicia para estas poblaciones ya de por sí es complicado, o sea, cabe mencionar, ¿no? Y por otro lado, creemos que el miedo a la criminalización más bien sabemos, que causa que muchas de las adolescencias no usen los servicios o programas existentes, los cuales se crearon a raíz del primer experimento, ¿no? Alejándoles también del ejercicio de sus derechos. Entonces, tenemos ambas partes de la moneda, cosas que funcionan, cosas que no. Y más que respuesta, tenemos muchas reflexiones sobre hacia dónde tendríamos que ir, ¿no? Y ver estos experimentos como una oportunidad de aprendizaje.
Muchísimas gracias, Sara. Y bueno, de México vamos a Asia. Madhu Merra, ¿puedes por favor compartir ahora con nosotros cuál es tu análisis sobre las cosas que funcionan y no de las leyes y matrimonio infantil?
Thanks, Eugenia. I'll speak about India primarily, but also draw some learnings from South Asia, which we've looked at from the point of view of research. The context in India is one where today, at least, entirely the data on underage marriages overlaps with poverty and marginalization. So it is the most marginalized communities where early marriage happens. And the age of marriage itself, of child marriage, has increased over the years. So what we are seeing is largely a phenomenon I'm sorry I got disconnected. Most unprepared for these things. Yeah. Can I be heard?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Mel.
So the other aspect which is prominent both India and South Asia is this whole issue of age of marriage, which in India now overlaps with the age of marriage for girls. The age of marriage for boys is 21, so it's a little higher than girls. What works in this context is that the law at least recognizes different types of underage marriages. So recognize as a category of forced marriages, which can be caused by abduction, trafficking, deceit, and so on. And there's distinguishes that from the that kind of marriage from the other category of marriage, which we know, although the law doesn't spell out, the largest category is arranged marriages by parents, as well as an emerging substantial category in India and South Asia is elopements. And so because the law recognizes and distinguishes between different types of underage marriages, the response is one where underage marriages can be declared voidable, as in they remain legal, but the minor party to the marriage can have it struck down, can opt out of the marriage. So, but it requires a minor party to actually go to a court of law and to nullify their marriage. We don't see that happening, but at least the law provides for it. The other aspect that is really useful in the law as it stands today is that it is the minor party has the right to be heard in any legal proceedings. So they have a say in saying whether they want the marriage to be nullified or not to be nullified, and they will be heard in a court of law. And I think these are two important things. And what doesn't work is that the law actually no longer, because the law was made a little earlier, it doesn't really consider that underage marriages is a phenomenon of poverty, of early labor, and so on. And so when you rely predominantly on a law for a problem that arises from poverty, then there is a mismatch. The law doesn't provide any social services. And so in that sense, that doesn't work for a law to only focus on the legal status of marriage, but not provide for social services, welfare schemes, and so on. Not look at married girls, because they actually don't want just the legal status to be decided by law. What they would really benefit from is education and other services that are provided for them. What doesn't work is that the age of consent is the same as age of marriage. So even in cases, the large number of cases that are prosecuted primarily by parents of girls who elope. So it's not the state machinery that is using the law. It is families that are using the law to punish girls for choosing a partner or marrying a person of their choice. And in those circumstances, when girls come to court and say that they want to stay in their marriage, the law can only decide whether to retain their marriage or to nullify it, but can't provide them any affirmative action in terms of welfare services, which I think is a gap and needs to be considered. The other thing that doesn't work is, even though the law on child marriage itself gives girls the option to exit or not to exit, the law on child sexual offenses is very severe. So it doesn't recognize consent until 18 years and can be very, very punitive for the boys involved in such marriages. And also girls, because they get sent to shelter homes. And since they refuse to go back to their natal homes, fearing punishment from their families. So that can be quite devastating scenario. And I think that's really the challenge that we're looking at here, And what we are seeing in 2 states where we've decided, which have opted to treat all marriages as invalid, as in have a blunt response to different kinds of marriages, the situation is no different. It remains the same because the ground realities are the same. So yes, thank you, Eugenia.
Thank you, Madhu. This is very interesting. And now we're going to go to the second part of the panel. So I'm going to change again to Spanish. Ahora vamos a la segunda pregunta. De cara al futuro y de acuerdo a estas experiencias que han compartido, ¿qué consideran que se necesita para avanzar y poder abordar de forma integral los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas? Y regresamos, por favor, en el mismo orden con Surbi. Surbi, tienes el micrófono, por favor.
Thank you, Eugenia. There is a long list of what needs to be done, but I would say, like, evidently in India, PCMA has been an effective tool to respond to the cases of child marriage. But in my experience, the law is rarely used by adolescent girls being married without their consent. The reason for this is that they feared community backlash, inaccessibility, and lack of sensitive and informed stakeholders. So firstly, there is a need to sensitize service provider. Secondly, while there is a constant focus and encouragement towards adolescent and young people's autonomy, choice, and decision making, we also need systems and structures which intentionally caters to those and not treat people making non-normative choices and lifestyles as miscreants. One of the examples of that would be, which my colleague from India was also mentioned, that when adolescents resist forced marriages and natal homes becomes the site of violence, the option that they have is the residential schools, which have some sort of quota for girls who need residential support to continue their education. But these shelter homes further intensifies the idea of protectionism and pushes many survivors back to their violent spaces. Because these social protection systems also infantilize them on the basis of gender norms that are prevalent in the society, which also brings our attention to the urgent which brings our attention to the urgent need of directly challenging and shifting the social norms that limit young people, especially young women's agency and participation in decision making. And lastly, I would say actually that there is a need to look at law from the rights-based approach and focus on holistic well-being of diverse adolescent and young people, as it very directly affects their quality of life. Over to you, Eugenia. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Surbi. Muy importante lo que dices, leyes que tengan un enfoque de derechos humanos. Alfa, ¿cuáles son tus recomendaciones desde África para seguir caminando en el abordaje de los matrimonios y las uniones tempranas?
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, to us, what we believe is, first of all, because we don't have the law that shows the minimum age of marriage is 18. So I believe that we need such kind of law by building the political will for the registrators and other decision makers, just to amend the 1971 marriage law, especially the section number 13 and section number 17. But also I can give you my experience that we are implementing a project with Amplify Change in ending child marriage. And when we started our project, we actually conducted some kind of interviews to almost 20 people in our the project areas. And then 19% of the people who asked about if they know what is child marriage, it is 19% of them, they know what child marriage is. But all 20 interviewee, they didn't know about Marriage Law Act of 1971. So the question that maybe we can ask, this law are created for whose benefit? So therefore, one thing that we think also it will work well is CSOs, partners, like funders, to support initiatives that aim in making a collective effort in creating awareness to the community about how the laws is applying in their community, but also using even these people who create implementing the awareness raising programs. They should also focus in using the approaches that is more simplified. As you know, talking about laws, there are a lot of jargons. So you have to use a very simplified approach so as to make the community understand easy, maybe the effects of child marriage, maybe how the law is applying when a person want to get marriage. For instance, the Medea Tanzania is using films just to narrow the message so as to make sure that even those people in the village, when they watch the film, it is easy for them to be able to understand the effects, but also to understand how the law is working in their environment. So by doing that, I believe that it is going also to solve the existing challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alfa. Sara, vamos ahora contigo. ¿Cuáles son tus recomendaciones para el abordaje de los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas?
Pues me parece complicado tener recomendaciones como muy concretas, pero sí creo que desde Balance hemos tratado de imaginar como otros futuros de hacia dónde nos gustaría encaminarnos sin tener la respuesta como óptima o la solución máxima, ¿no? Pero sí una dirección un poco hacia dónde queremos ir. Lo primero que vemos es que deberíamos de estar promoviendo leyes que sean integrales, que incluyan elementos de autonomía, de consentimiento de las adolescencias, y que esos dos elementos puedan estar en el centro, y también el placer, ¿no? ¿Cómo hacemos que las adolescencias tengan vidas que les permitan ejercer el placer, vivir vidas placenteras, ¿no? Y que en estas leyes que se hagan exista participación sustantiva también de las adolescencias, ¿no? Parece ser que hasta ahora poco o nada se les ha incluido en pensar siquiera soluciones a una dinámica cuyas principales personas afectadas son ellas, ¿no? Creo que ese es un punto de partida fundamental, generar esos diálogos con las propias adolescencias, con las propias personas que están siendo afectadas por este fenómeno, para incluirles en la solución. Por otro lado, creo que es importante que como activistas empecemos a crear voluntades políticas para ir más allá de la ley y no solamente generar parches a través de la ley, ¿no? En México vemos que los políticos, los servidores públicos e incluso las personas tendemos a pensar a la ley y en específico a los códigos penales, probablemente por el punitivismo que tenemos muy adentro todas las personas, como primera respuesta, ¿no? Creemos que el crear un nuevo tipo penal o el mover una ley va a ser una respuesta, pero la realidad es que un papel no necesariamente cambia la realidad, ¿no? México tiene distintos contextos, tiene muchísimas problemáticas que se intersectan, digamos, y que no necesariamente lo que está en una ley, uno, va a cambiar una realidad en el contexto más favorecedor, digamos, pero mucho menos en un contexto que de por sí ya es complicado, ¿no? Donde hay muchas como vertientes mezclándose por ahí dentro, ¿no? Y entonces por eso es que es importante generar estas voluntades políticas, porque creemos que es importante trabajar en los diferentes, digamos, como niveles o en los diferentes contextos para sensibilizar sobre el tema y entonces generar soluciones que estén basadas en el trabajo comunitario y en específico del trabajo con las adolescencias, ¿no? Esto nos va a permitir entonces atacar las causas base de los matrimonios y uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas, ¿no? Porque hay que pensar entonces en por qué se perpetúan, por qué siguen existiendo o por qué han existido históricamente, ¿no? Y qué beneficios le están dando a quienes participan en ellas, no necesariamente a las adolescencias, pero también a estas otras personas que podrían ser la red de apoyo, que son partícipes de este tipo de arreglos, matrimonios y uniones, ¿no? Entonces, el pensar justamente los porqués nos va a ayudar a entender soluciones y a crear soluciones que nos dejen pensar más allá como del cuadrito, ¿no? Outside the box. Em, y también pensar si queremos usar la ley, si esa es una vía, entonces, ¿cómo hacemos que esa ley, digamos, se traduzca en una realidad, ¿no? En México sabemos que mucho del acceso a la justicia está interpelado también por procesos de corrupción, no de las autoridades, de no necesariamente ver ambas partes, ¿no? Como de la moneda y entonces también tendríamos que pensar en si vamos a querer usar las leyes como una herramienta y no un fin en sí mismo. Pensar tal vez en reformas judiciales amplias que permitan poner el consentimiento y la autonomía en el centro y que las personas que están encargadas del acceso a la justicia y de la restitución de los derechos puedan entender que estos dos elementos, el consentimiento y la autonomía, son centrales, ¿no? Y que deberían ser la base que guía las decisiones que se tomen. Eso requiere muchísimo trabajo, ¿no? Y requiere pensar más allá de necesariamente los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas. Toca pensar en todo un sistema de acceso a la justicia en México, ¿no? Si quisiéramos usar las leyes. Y es por eso que nosotros apostamos a ver otras alternativas, ¿no? Que no tenga que ver necesariamente con la promoción de nuevas leyes específicas, sino más bien de trabajo comunitario y de atacar justamente las causas que generan los matrimonios y las uniones infantiles tempranas y forzadas, como podría ser la pobreza, como podrían ser las desigualdades persistentes, como podrían ser las diferentes costumbres que pudieran existir, incentivos positivos, negativos, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, para nosotros eso es lo central, como empezar a ver hacia ese lado y empezar a transformar soluciones con base en, pues sí, las voluntades y las necesidades de las adolescencias que están siendo principalmente afectadas por este tipo de arreglos.
Muchas gracias, Sara. Creo que tocaste temas muy importantes tú también. Y para cerrar con broche de oro, vamos con Madhu. Madhu, ¿cuáles son tus recomendaciones para el futuro?
So in terms of the few recommendations I can offer based on the work my organization has done, laws are really not the answer. You need a law for sure on minimum age of marriage, but it cannot be the solution for child marriage. It can only follow if a lot of other interventions are in place. If even in terms of the law, I think what we really need going forward is we need to look across the countries at how laws are working, whether laws are working, who is using them, what are the results of law, what are the long-term consequences on the girls. So I think if the focus is just on numbers of child marriage, then we are not getting a sense of whether the law is really benefiting the girls. Our focus of any study should be what are the consequences of using the law on the girls. So these have to be meaningful studies and not just collection of numbers. So that's one thing. The second thing is which are the sites of prevalence? India is a large country. We see some population groups where child marriage has long disappeared, and some population groups where it does occur, which is predominantly prevalent. So I would not be surprised if that is the story in other parts of the world too. So if these population groups where child marriage is prevalent, are linked to deprivation, marginalization, and poverty, then that's where the interventions must be. A law can't fix it. And law should not be used to fix it because it ends up punishing those communities who are already, the worst off in any society. So I think that's something we need to be hear too much that it is that child marriage occurs because of customs. But a lot has changed since in the last 20 years. And we need to take a fresh look at what is driving child marriage. Is it the need for early labor? Is it need to sustain laboring families? Is it need for farm hands? So we really need that kind of investigation rather than just a lot of laws that are based on surveillance. And I would say that in terms of laws itself, so far the attempts have been to create laws that just are, overarching, very uniform, and really heightened surveillance. I would say, that needs to really dial down. And what we need is to look at the intersectional laws. How are they impacting underage marriage? If there is no age of sexual consent until the age of adulthood, that will drive child marriage, rather early marriage. So age of consent cannot be dealing from the age of marriage. And recommendations should be, or policies should be for the twin issues. So that's one thing. The other thing is there are attempts, certainly, we've seen that conversation in India too and elsewhere, where the age of marriage being proposed is 21 years. Nepal is 20 years. India for men is 21 years. And any age that goes beyond and well into adulthood is not desirable. Adults should have the right to decide what they want to do. Circumstances, if they are changed effectively, they will decide to marry later. So I think those are the different changes. We need to look at laws intersectionally. We need to look at what's driving different types of child marriage. And I don't think we need to always take the worst case scenario and build the law around it, which we tend to do. So those are my suggestions. Thanks.
Muchísimas gracias a las 4 panelistas. Creo que ha sido muy interesante escuchar que, bueno, por un lado, las leyes han logrado promover una discusión amplia sobre el tema y cómo abordarlo. También ha fortalecido la participación de sociedad civil y ha traído la conversación sobre el ecosistema de normas sociales y culturales. Pero bueno, también la ley no puede ser la única solución y definir la edad de matrimonio no puede ser la única solución legal. Hemos visto que se han limitado las respuestas que consideran la autonomía y la participación de las adolescentes y existe el riesgo de que la edad de consentimiento sexual se eleve para equipararla con el matrimonio. También pues se ha expresado la preocupación por estas aproximaciones punitivistas que buscan resolver problemas sociales con cárcel y tenemos desafíos importantes para lograr que las leyes sean integrales e intersectoriales para que puedan romper los estereotipos y que garanticen los derechos humanos de las adolescentes. Pues finalmente también es fundamental que las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y las adolescentes participen y sean parte del diseño, la implementación y la evaluación. Les recordamos que tenemos el pronunciamiento, el link lo van a compartir de nuevo en el chat. El posicionamiento del grupo de trabajo justo apunta a estos análisis y a estas recomendaciones. Y quisiera abrir el espacio para las compañeras que están con nosotros del mismo grupo de trabajo para que nos compartan algunas de sus ideas también. Recuerden seguir mandando sus preguntas en el chat de preguntas y respuestas y le doy ahora la palabra a Margaret Green del grupo de trabajo.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of the panelists for a really wonderful description of what is good and what is not so good. And I think Praise's comment in the chat also, highlights what we also think, which is that laws, although they're important, they must be, implemented in the context of broader work, and the laws themselves have to be fine-tuned carefully. My name is Margaret Green. I'm with Greenworks Research Consultancy in Washington, D.C., and a very proud member of the Sexuality Working Group for a number of years now. I just wanted to make a quick comment about, all of the legal emphasis has been on the prevention of child marriage, and I wanted to build on Madhu's reference to the consequences of the laws for girls, that this should be kind of what we have in mind primarily. And to me, one of the most important signs that laws haven't always been developed in girls' best interest is the fact that these laws are scarcely relevant for girls after marriage. There's a profound lack of legal support for girls after marriage, a lack of legal resources for married girls. And to me, this begs the question, if nations, if societies really care about girls, how is it that we leave them in a zone of silence and neglect once they marry? So the report that we have shared the link for highlights an illustration of how laws don't reflect a consistent commitment to girls, including married girls' well-being. And Sarah Martinez touched on Mexico's 2014 law, which set the minimum age of marriage at 18 without exception, and urged states to incorporate this change into their state-level legislation. And of course, this led to a reduction in registered marriages. But among mothers under 18, the reduction in the number of girls who married was offset by an equivalent rise in the number who were in informal unions. And at the same time, one of the arguments that people make about delaying marriage and preventing child marriage is that it inhibits girls' school engagement with school. So the desired effect of banning formal marriage below the age of 18, it should be, it should lead to increases in girls' school enrollment and reductions in adolescent birth rates, but these were not affected by the law in Mexico. And then finally, and this is a problem particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, that girls in informal unions, of which there are many, cannot access the protections that are granted to those who are in formal marriages. So girls are informal unions are really in a difficult situation. There are some great exceptions to the lack of laws for married girls, and I wanted to highlight a mention that we make in the report about the example of the Southern African Development Community model law on child marriage, which emphasizes the importance of a multi-sectoral approach, both to preventing child early and forced marriages and unions, and supporting married people married before the age of 18. And Mozambique has developed its national law with reference to this template. So that's really valuable. In research with my colleagues Siddiqui, Aligar, and Stoppel, we've found in our work on what kinds of supports exist for married girls, the stated, basically the arguments that people make for delaying marriage are not, they should logically drive attention to certain kinds of supports after marriage. But what you see programmatically is a total emphasis on basically the sexual and reproductive lives of married girls, with a neglect of their schooling, their protection from intimate partner violence, and possibly their desire, any support for the need to seek a separation or divorce or seek child custody. And I wanted to mention that in another study with Ricker and colleagues on the idea of divorce in the context of child marriage, that basically that right to leave marriage is what makes marriage a choice. And laws tend to focus on the ability to choose if, when, and whom to marry, but they don't really have any space in them for the possibility of exiting, which is what makes marriage a choice. So, girls can be reported as, for the crime of leaving marriage. Marital violence is not routinely treated by legal systems as a crime. And finally, because they are children, girls and young women married before the age of 18 are often ineligible for the supports and services that would be available to adult women. So it's really, they're in a terrible bind. So basically, the law really is important, as Shireen Ebadi says. It really establishes, it reflects society's aspirations for what could be. And the lack of legal support for people marrying under the age of 18 really has to be addressed in a holistic way, not only to aid in preventing those marriages, but also to support young people in responding to violence, neglect, if possible, school attendance, continuing school attendance, separation, retaining custody of their children. And there's a huge amount of capacity building that needs to happen to make all of that possible, and to shift a little bit this total focus on child marriage prevention.
Thank you, Meg, for this very important insight. Arushi, now we will open the floor for you, please.
Thanks, Eugenia. Okay, and there's my video. Just adding to what all our amazing participants have said, and there was a question just on the point I wanted to raise, is that given that all of us here are concerned about addressing gender-based harms faced by young people, it would be very important for us to distinguish between approaches that are protectionist in nature and approaches that protect young people's rights. So a good way of going about distinguishing them would be to see if the approach is based on stereotypes, if it reinforces existing power structures, and it's based on the paternalistic assumption that all young people do not have the capacity or ability to take decisions for themselves. Protectionist approaches often reinforce the status quo and don't work on transforming the social structures that Madhu was referring to that lead to so many young people entering marriages at early ages. When we talk about approaches that protect young people's rights, we would have to think about the evolving capacity of young people, deconstruct the idea that young people is a homogeneous category, and think about how to expand young people's autonomy while giving them the tools, resources, and information needed for them to make decisions about their sexuality, sexual lives, and intimate lives. Even as we think about these issues further, one topic that has been raised by different panelists is where do we talk of young people's well-being and pleasure? And if whenever we talk about young people and gender-based harms and violence, the immediate thought is to focus on a criminal law-centric approach, then that really restricts our opportunity to talk about pleasure, well-being, and safe spaces. Safe spaces has also become a word that is used quite a bit, but it would be very important for us to unpack what we mean by that. Do young people have their own safe spaces, even when there are extremely restrictive environments with punitive laws impacting them? And lastly, just in the spirit of this webinar and everything that the working group has been doing, we would definitely encourage more cross-movement and more cross-regional conversations, especially among child rights, women's rights, and feminist groups, all of whom are working to protect and expand young people's rights. So thank you, and looking forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you, Arushi. Bueno, es muy motivante ver cómo nos apasiona este tema, sin duda, y estamos viendo las evidencias, lo que funciona, lo que no funciona. Muchísimas gracias por compartir. Tenemos ahora a José Roberto Luna, quien es el líder a nivel global desde UNFPA para el tema de matrimonio infantil. Muchas gracias, José Roberto. Es un placer tenerte con nosotras para que nos acompañes a pensar cómo podemos aprovechar esta evidencia que está emergiendo. Además, bueno, a ti te tocó de primera mano en Guatemala esta ola, entonces, pues, conocer cuáles serían, pues, tus recomendaciones.
Thank you, Eugenia, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us as UNFPA here. The conversation has been extremely not only interesting, but inspiring, because we can see how the whole field about ending child marriage has been evolving. I'm not sure we could have this conversation with the level of complexity, nuances, learnings, clear ideas, and vision before, or maybe 10 years ago. We all know that laws are the expression of formal and explicit dimensions of what societies think, believe, value in specific contexts. And in this case, for example, as a global community, we also have seen how the proliferation of child marriage laws is also coming from the global agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, because this is one of the most practical elements that governments have to make sure that they are sending a clear message in terms of how do they understand this harmful practice or this issue as a human rights violation in their country. We also know how laws are the formal mechanism, and it's really expressing what the people would like to see in their country. However, we also know, and this has been said very, very clearly here today, in terms of how child marriage laws in most countries, even when they are the immediate action to respond, are not enough. And we know that from evidence from the World Bank before, all the evidence emerging right now, a systematic review, for example, conducted recently by the Population Council, is reinforcing this conversation, the clear evidence that just laws of ending child marriage, and especially those just setting the minimum age at marriage, are not enough as a standalone intervention, are not going to be enough. And that was clearly said by Madhu, for example, saying, look, what are the drivers of child marriage? What are the root causes? It's about poverty, it's about unemployment, it's about lack of decision-making, bodily autonomy. It's about equal rights for women and men. It goes beyond the simple idea of setting protectionist or prohibitions in terms of the legal aspects in policy making. But we also know that policy making is a very, very, very not only complex but dynamic process. And as you have said, for example, Sarah, this policy making process sometimes have the people affected sitting at the table, but sometimes this is just simply happening as a way to express that you want to protect populations. And child marriage laws, regarding your question, Eugenia, based on the evidence, all the learnings, all this rich conversation you are providing to the global community today, are calling for comprehensive approaches and holistic visions. And with comprehensive approaches, you said, Margaret, for example, how the SADC community has been reflecting about child marriage laws shouldn't go only with the legal age of marriage. It should also be looking at what are the kind of interventions that are going to solve the issue, that are going to contribute to the elimination. And we need to complement those policy-making exercises with the evidence we have in terms of what works, not only for the laws, but for the whole spectrum. We also need to be and to make sure that all these policy making and legal reforms are not affecting at least 3 ages of consent. I know this is not new for most of you. The legal age of consent, for example, for marriage, but also the age of consent for accessing services, and particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights services, but also the age of consent for sexual relationships. When we don't see this as the whole spectrum, a lot of unintended consequences can emerge from what was part of a lot of well-intentions or good intentions, but are not going to be translated in something that is going to be transformative in the lives of adolescents, and in this case, in particular for adolescent girls. I saw, for example, Sajida asking about what are the relationships about premarital sex and child marriage? What are the exceptions saying? laws and policy making is not a neutral process. It's coming with a lot of values, with a lot of stereotyping, with gender norms, with patriarchal elements that are set in a very, very old institution. We are talking here about the institution of marriage. So we really need as a global community to take into consideration and to look in advance if we are starting these conversations, what the unintended consequences could be. I'm also, I'm taking a lot of reflections that we can really use, for example, as UNFPA across all the country offices that are implementing programs to end child marriage in more than 150 countries. Just to say that, for example, we know how difficult it is for a young person to exercise their bodily autonomy and their sexual and reproductive rights. But when it comes to child marriage, we are most of the time prioritizing only the principle of protection, and we are not considering this comprehensive approach in terms of the evolving capacities, the principle of autonomy, and how are we going to make sure that the proposals are not coming in detrimental of their agency, autonomy, decision-making, and power, because we cannot talk about transformative elements if they don't have the power for making decisions. But we all know this is not an easy process. All of us who have been involved in any kind of negotiation, for example, regarding the country, it's a very complex process. Who are the ones who are going to have access, for example, to those negotiations? Who are going to be heard? What are the real mechanisms to get into those conversations? What's the real space for influencing? What's the capacity of civil society in a complex world where also the access to resources is limited? And we also need to be very, very aware, not only in terms of what the evidence is saying, but what the political context is actually right now setting for this conversation. Because we know that there is a global movement pushing back the progress on gender equality, human rights, and all what has something to do with bodily autonomy, decision making, or power over the bodies and lives of people. So yes, I agree. We really need to look at the root causes, and we need to look at how the laws and policies are part of the whole spectrum of the solutions, but are not the only solution. I think it's going to be very, very difficult that governments are going to say, look, we are not going to advance with the legal aspects because this is what they do. And this is also connected to human rights and with accountability. But the content and the process should take all the considerations that you were saying, how to avoid paternalistic policy making, but also how to avoid laws that are just going to be leading to criminalization of young people. Because if we cannot look in advance at those unintended consequences, of course, we have a huge risk of doing harm. And I think this conversation, I'm totally grateful as UNFPA and as part of this global community in terms of all the nuances you are bringing. But we really need to prevent this infantilization, as you said. We need to look at holistic well-being. We need to, at least my recommendation would be for all of us who are part of different conversations around, for example, human rights mechanisms, or regardless where's the space where we are participating, please keep the principle of autonomy along with evolving capacities and protection. Because if not, we are also, even unintentionally, we could be part of those conversations leading to something that was not planned before. Because I also have seen personally how everything that you are setting in the political space maybe is not going to be, in practice, is going to look very, very different, because this is how the world works. We need to embrace, like this complexity thinking, because we are talking about here about many different contexts across the world. And we need to take into consideration the particular nuances, the religious elements, the norms, the stereotyping, all the grounded elements that are going to be shaping the policy making, because as I said, this is not a neutral space. And we need to make sure that those affected, and in this case, from a power dimension, are sitting at the table. And we need to be ready to also propose what are going to be the remedies from a human rights perspective in the cases where we are seeing that these laws are leading to unintended consequences. Let me stop there, Eugenia, and thank you so much again.
No, thank you for bringing these elements into the conversation, José Roberto. Por favor, recuerden compartir sus preguntas en el chat de preguntas. Vamos a dar ahora el espacio para abordar las que han llegado. La primera que tengo es para Alfa. Nos preguntan si hay alguna excepción en los casos en donde hay un embarazo antes del matrimonio como causa de ese matrimonio infantil. Alfa, ¿nos puedes compartir un poco más de información?
Okay, can you please come again?
I'm going to say it in English, it might be easier. Are there any exceptions in cases of premarital pregnancy as a driver of child marriage?
Okay, I can answer that. In Tanzania, actually, like a pregnancy is one of the early pregnancy or the early pregnancy is one of the key driver of the early marriage. But actually, in real sense, marriage is not a solution for this kind of early marriage. So, I mean, early marriage is not a solution for the early pregnancy. That's why we as a feminist, we are trying also to push for the changes of this marriage law of 1971, which actually indicates, the law indicates itself that if a girl is in the age of 14 and she is pregnant, then the court of law can approve for her marriage. And actually in the community, particularly in the rural areas, they also believe that for someone to have a pregnancy in early, before getting married is something inappropriate. So getting for her to be able to get married to someone, it's like they are trying to collect the mistake that she have done. So to us, as a feminist, we believe that for these girls to be forced to get married because of pregnancy, it's not okay. That's why we are currently actually advocating for the changes of these laws. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Alfa. Now we have a question that can be answered by anybody that want to volunteer. How do you reconcile the very real need for protection from violence with the ways in which protection laws and protection arguments are used paternalistically to undermine adolescents' rights and agency? I guess that's the, the main question of our field, right? So please feel free to volunteer to answer this question or a part of this question.
If I may, we don't really recognize, although domestic violence we know affects young people too. And natal family violence is a huge concern. At least in India, we have so much coming out which we need to document. But we just talk about matrimonial violence. And so we need to understand violence in all its shades and spheres, and the law needs to respond to that. This conversation on residential educational facilities, the quality of those facilities, I mean, a lot needs to be done rather than protect women in their matrimonial homes, see that as a site of violence, and then think if they're sitting in their natal homes, it's all okay. So just a quick response.
Thank you, Madhu. Anybody else wants to also come in?
Eugenia, I can share an experience we had when I was in Guatemala as a program officer. Something that happened, and this is just to express the complexity when we are talking about the legal aspects, because, for example, we didn't have any legal barrier in practice, but personnel from the Ministry of Health, they were saying, based on interpretation of the law, that they were not able to provide access to services to young people, in particular to adolescent girls, because they were taking the law against sexual violence, the legal age, or, you know, like the 14 years old, as a basis to say, I'm not going to give you access to services. So we had to go through a whole legal analysis saying, look, no, this is not correct. The interpretation is, the law is not saying anything about that, but that was being used just to say, I'm not going to provide the service because we are going to receive, for example, demands against the Ministry of Health. But this is just to share, actually, at some point, you really need to differentiate what we are talking about. How, for example, the age of consent for marriage is really linked or not to services, because sometimes the framework is for protection, other times is for access to services, but this is not clear to everyone. And as somebody said during the conversation, how families are using the messages from the law to say something different, or to use to reinforce other ideas or conventions. That's a totally different scenario. However, it's also risky. I think having clarity in terms of what's the scope of every single framework and how them can complement each other is needed. But that, of course, requires that you are going to invest time for making sure these messages are clear and accessible to everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Jose Roberto and Madu. I'm going to give space for another question that is also very interesting. So in the question about how to make laws that are with an intersectional approach, connecting education, skills, access to jobs, information, menstrual health information, and considering the impact of early marriage and early pregnancy, do we have any examples of laws that have already been doing this combination of approaches that we can share? Do you have any examples of intersectional laws that have been in place in countries? No?
Eugenia, let me take back, and I know that we can have a very critical analysis here because also we have Madu and others on the call, but for example, Meg made a reference to the SADC model law. And I know that sometimes having model laws can be also problematic because in certain contexts that could be taken as a recipe, and we know this is not necessarily the intention behind. However, something that I've seen is the value of this SADC model law, regardless many things that can be improved along the way and also based on the context, is that it's calling for comprehensive reforms. Because sometimes we are not considering how, for example, child marriage laws are going to be affecting other laws, and this conversation is not happening sometimes. How do you manage, for example, now the protection in terms of sexual violence? How do you manage right now, for example, the keeping girls in school when there is another law saying no, pregnant girls cannot stay, for example, in the regular hours? So in this case, for example, that's why I was talking about comprehensive legal reforms. We really need to look at those elements based on what we know is going to be ending child marriage or leading to the elimination or the transformation of the practice comprehensively, because if not, you are going to have a lot of loopholes, and then you will need another advocacy process just to go behind and look after that lagging element. This is happening in most of the countries where after going through these legal processes, you have to do something else for making sure that theirs are going to be accepted in school, just to give an example. So in that case, I think that proposal is positive in that sense, that is saying, look, if you are a parliamentarian, if you are a policymaker, please consider all the different dimensions and also how are you going to harmonize those elements, because that also can lead to criminalization. If you don't look at the full picture, that can lead to criminalization.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. También sabemos que en República Dominicana y en Costa Rica, en América Latina, se han tratado de hacer estas intersecciones entre embarazos en la adolescencia y matrimonio infantil. Tal vez podríamos tener otro webinario sobre ese tema en específico. Bueno, vamos a pasar a la última etapa de nuestro webinario y es en donde nos gustaría que ustedes, por favor, como participantes, usen el chat. Vamos a hacer una lluvia de chat y que nos pongan si algo les sorprendió del webinario de hoy, algo aprendieron, algo que les hizo cambiar su perspectiva. Please, we're going to do a chat rain. Please share with us if something surprised you, if you learned something, if your perspective has been changed. Just put it on the chat, please. Pongan. ¿Podemos compartir ahora, por favor? Let's share what you included in the chat, please. Creo que las word clouds y las encuestas son más populares. Gracias por iniciar. Muchas gracias. Bueno, pues creo que esos fueron los comentarios en lo que acaban de poner. Les queremos dar muchas gracias por habernos compartido su tiempo, su espacio, su cabeza para acompañarnos en este diálogo. Queremos seguir la conversación. Vamos a compartir los materiales y la grabación del webinario con ustedes. Vamos a pensar qué otras cosas hacer. Queremos llevar esta conversación sobre las leyes a otras audiencias, pensar juntos, traer más buenos casos y más temas para la conversación. Por favor, tengan atención a nuestras invitaciones. A nombre del Grupo de Trabajo sobre Sexualidad y Matrimonio y Uniones Infantiles Tempranas y Forzadas, les queremos agradecer su participación. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Eugenia, to the group and everyone.
Gracias a ustedes, a las panelistas, muchas gracias.
No, gracias a ustedes también.